Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily update for December 28th, 2021. It's now been announced that the talks between Russia and the United States on the draft treaties proposed by Vladimir Putin when he met with Biden on December 7th, that those discussions will begin on January 12th. Now, the Russians are continuing to insist that otherwise, if these new treaty proposals are not adopted, which would prevent eastward expansion of NATO and prevent the arming of Ukraine, that if these are not adopted, then it's an indication of crossing a red line. And in fact, various Russian spokesmen have said we are already at that red line. Now, that makes these talks extremely serious. And the question is, will the U.S. use the time between now and January 12th to put more weapons into Ukraine to increase the threat to Russia that Putin is expressing, that he and the Russians feel very directly is a threat? Will that continue? Or is there an intention for a serious discussion about why the Russians see this as a threat? What Putin has emphasized repeatedly is that by moving weaponry, NATO weaponry, into Ukraine, which could include nuclear bombers and missiles, that they would be 4 to 5 minutes away from Moscow, which is not acceptable. For the same reason that John Kennedy launched the blockade of Cuba in 1962, because it's unacceptable to place offensive weapons on the border or near the border of a country which you consider a potential adversary in war. So the request for this meeting, or the demand for this meeting, appears to have been accepted, but we'll see what happens with it. Now, Putin has said, we have no place to retreat. Russia is, the borders with Ukraine, with the Baltic states and others are set. And Russian troop movements are all occurring within the borders of Russia, whereas NATO is moving troops and weapons up to the borders of Russia in other countries. Now, there were some documents that we've been looking at from 1994-95, which show that in July of 1994, President Bill Clinton had a discussion with President Boris Yeltsin of Russia, in which he pledged essentially a partnership for peace, which included the possibility of bringing Russia into some kind of official relationship with NATO. But several months later, in December, Clinton declared that no nation outside of NATO can veto expansion. So something occurred between the July meeting and the December speech by Clinton. You know what that was? The Republicans swept the midterm elections, and Clinton was in part, and this is not definitive, we're still looking at this, because we don't know what Clinton intended, but it would be useful to know for the sake of the discussion, because what it does show, and other documents show, is that while the U.S. was promising something to Russia, exactly as it had in February 1990, no eastward expansion, that while they were offering assurances, they were proceeding with plans to expand NATO eastward. So another internal U.S. cable has emerged in which it's stated that the discussions about expansion should be private and there should be no public discussion, but these plans to tighten the encirclement of Russia continued. And that's what we're seeing again today. That's what the Russians are reacting to. So this is the true history, where the U.S. made pledges that it has repeatedly broken. And that's why Putin is skeptical when the U.S. and NATO say they have no serious intent against Russia. That's why the Russians are very worried that giving more weapons to Ukrainians, including some of the crazies of the Azov Battalion and others who were involved in the Maidan coup in 2014, that they would use those weapons for an assault into the eastern Ukraine region, which Russia has granted some protection to the people there from precisely these ethnic cleansing crazies of Kiev. So, do you think Putin is not clear on this history, that he doesn't understand it? Of course he does. And that's why the danger continues. And we're compiling a chronology of this picture, which should be out in a day or two, which will give to everyone who wants it a true picture of what is behind the current crisis between Ukraine and Russia, and why it's essential that the U.S. and Russia reach an agreement and not do it from the standpoint that we're going to force you to back down. That's the attitude that's coming from Jake Sullivan, from Blinken, from Stoltenberg of NATO. To turn this into a nuclear chicken game is an absurd intent, especially when you're dealing with a danger of nuclear war. Now, in contrast to that, we have something very interesting I want to bring to your attention, which was a statement released yesterday by a colleague of mine from Houston, Texas, Joel DeJean, who's an independent candidate for Congress in Texas. And he put out a statement about the 450th birth of Johannes Kepler, which was on December 7th. Kepler developed a series of hypotheses about the laws of the universe and to develop the laws of planetary motion, which were done without advanced telescopes, which were done primarily through his hypothesis, through his mind, demonstrating an incredible capability to come to terms with laws of the physical universe that were unseen and there was no way of verifying it other than through observations by Brahe and others. Now, this is Kepler's work was among the most significant breakthroughs in intellectual history ever. And his books, The New Astronomy, The Harmonies of the World, provided scientists for centuries insights into how creative discoveries can be made. Now, this is significant because on Christmas Day, the James Webb Space Satellite was launched. The Space Telescope, I should say, was launched on its way to an observation point 1.5 million kilometers from the Earth. This is a project which involves scientists from 14 nations and will enable them to have a view at the great expanse of space, possibly looking into 13 billion years of history in the formation of our universe and how it has evolved. This is what money should be spent for. This is what, or I should say, what credit should be allocated for. This is the example of cooperation in which you have minds from many, many nations working in harmony to uncover the harmonies of the universe. This is what is most exciting about science, not the ability to obliterate people with drones or with chemical weapons or with nuclear weapons, but to be able to cooperate in solving the great mysteries of the universe. And so I think this is an important indication from a congressional candidate of the direction that people running for Congress should be looking. Instead of blustering about cutting spending and getting rid of fossil fuels, look to science, look to the future, and figure out ways that we can work with other nations, including other nations that are also spacefaring nations, like Russia and China, or the newly discovered or newly established space programs in several African countries. This is where the future lies. So that's my update for today. I'll be back with you again tomorrow.